I'd like to start by revisiting the key theme of our weekend, which is optimization and innovation. As we heard yesterday from Sir John, innovations are steadily being developed across the different biomedical fields, but healthcare systems are slow and inefficient at taking them on. And although the newest and most innovative medical technologies are extremely exciting, our healthcare systems are quite slow, and it's difficult to make them come into clinical usage and affect the worldwide healthcare system to reach every patient. This dichotomy is fundamental to the function and evolution of healthcare, and we hope that today's program can shed some further light on how to best manage it. Today's first panel will focus on optimization and innovation in drug development, specifically the tensions between market opportunities in the field and the needs of global healthcare systems. Although recent innovations in drug development have promised revolutionary genomics-based precision technologies, it's not clear whether these will actually address the most urgent needs of global health. And indeed, with the rising costs of medical care, the focus on developing these expensive treatments may only increase health inequities. So these questions are further complicated by the business models of the biotech industry. Do companies have a responsibility to public healthcare systems, to individual patients, or indeed just to their shareholders? And if so, how do they decide which drugs to fund? And further, how is this complicated by political realities like Brexit and the US elections? So this panel will be moderated by Dr. Fred Cohen, whom we met yesterday. Fred is a partner at TPG Biotech, which is a life science venture capital group. And prior to joining TPG in 2001, he was a professor of medicine, cellular and molecular pharmacology, biochemistry and biophysics, and pharmaceutical chemistry at UCSF. I hope I got that right. In this context, he was chief of the Division of Endocrinology and Metabolism and directed an active research program in prion biology, structure-based drug design, bioinformatics, and heteropolymer chemistry. The other members of the panel are Dr. Deborah Cohen, Dr. Paul Stoffels, Dr. Ramona Doyle, and Dr. Elizabeth Pisani. And Fred will introduce them in more detail. So I hope you enjoy this panel, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Fred Cohen.
Thanks very much. Well, it's always a little off-putting to hear about things you did a long time ago, because it sort of begs the question, can you remember what it was? Not 100% sure I can, so please, no questions about that. Thanks for taking the time today. It's really exciting to see the level of interest in healthcare evident in this community. And it appears that the second colloquium on this topic is about double the attendance as the first, and so congratulations to the organizers for doing a spectacular job of bringing people from all over the world here. I would also add, I'm incredibly impressed by the people that I've met here who are now doing their studies in Oxford. You guys bring an intellect and enthusiasm and sort of zeal for changing the world that we all need, especially in light of the past week. So with that as a preamble, maybe I'll start by asking the members of the panel to introduce themselves. Deborah, do you want to start?
So I'm Deborah Cohen. I initially trained to be a doctor, physician, and I worked for the British medical BMJ for quite a while. I work as an investigative journalist, now with the BBC as well. And I've been doing some work with Transparency International about corruption in health. So I think I will quote the scientific director of European Medicines Agency, who said to me, "You're the most conflicted person here." Yes, I do what it says on the tin. I'm an investigative journalist, so I don't bring good news.
Paul?
Well, I'm Paul Stoffels. Started as a doctor in Africa. I lived and worked for 4 years in Congo and Rwanda. And then started doing HIV research with Dr. Paul Janssen in the pharmaceutical industry. Did that for many years. Left Janssen as we didn't have results and started my own biotechs. Tibotec and Verco. Diagnostics and drugs in HIV. Was able to bring a few new drugs. Which
very impressive work.
1 in 3 prescriptions in the US today is for one of the drugs we developed with the team. And so that brought life back to patients with MDR HIV. And then I started to lead the Janssen group in the pharmaceutical group in Johnson & Johnson, and are applying new technologies, new science, new capabilities for medical needs in the world, and running a big pharmaceutical company.
And quite successfully, actually. Ramona?
I'm Ramona Doyle. Do I have one of those microphones? I hope not. I started my career as a clinical professor at Stanford, where I take care of expensive patients with complex heart and lung diseases, and I ran the lung transplant program there. I also trained during the HIV epidemic in San Francisco, which made a great impression on me, about the fact that as hard as I worked, it was drugs that made the difference in that epidemic and continues to make a difference. I took a sabbatical from Stanford, did a rotation in biotech and stayed and worked for a couple of companies in biotech in the Bay Area. Most recently, I worked for the state of California for the California Stem Cell Institute, which is an unusual institute funded by the voters of California to help forward scientific work in cell-based therapies. And I know Fred, I'm on the faculty at UCSF where I continue to see patients as well. And I'm really delighted to be here, and I'll just echo what Fred has said. The colleagues, the students, the folks we've had a chance to meet is very impressive. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Elizabeth?
I'm Elizabeth Pisani. I started off as an investigative journalist many years ago, and then tipped into epidemiology. And if you're the most conflicted person here, I'm the most ill-qualified. I know virtually nothing about drug development, so I say that up front. But I have an interest in particularly avoiding the necessity for drugs at all, but the effective prevention and effective use of non-drug technologies like sanitation. But I've also been working recently a little bit on antimicrobial resistance, and particularly the relationship between drug quality and antimicrobial resistance. And so I'm interested not just in the development of new drugs, but actually the safeguarding of the quality and effectiveness of the drugs that already exist.
Great, thanks. And so one of the natural tensions that sets up in this discussion is between new drug discovery and the generics industry. So I don't know, Deborah, do you want to make a few comments about generics and generic drugs and what you see? And Elizabeth, you've got some thoughts on that area. And how do you see the generics industry helping on a global scale? And what are the problems that people have run into?
I'll draw this back to some work I've just been doing with Transparency International, and the generics industry is something that's come up. Actually, it came up in a conversation I had with a GP friend on Friday evening, where an asthma inhaler that is generic for use with asthma. They've been using it for ages in their GP practice, and their CCG, which is their commissioning group that kind of says what they shouldn't prescribe, and have now told them to use a branded drug based on no kind of effective outcomes. So you kind of worry about where certain ties are within that clinical commissioning group and where that on high is coming. And something we're seeing a little bit in the UK is the ABPI, which is the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry, has a is that someone's hand up? No? Okay, oh, no, it's
No, taking a picture of you. You're obviously on the more photogenic side of the panel. So
also
there you
blind
go.
as well, clearly. And what's happening is they have a scorecard that comes out every year to say which areas innovative, and I take exception with the word use of innovative here. What they mean is branded, type 2 diabetes medicine, or a branded kind of the latest cholesterol lowering agent or something. They are putting pressure on certain areas in the National Health Service where perhaps they're using generic, but they're not using something that is branded that has come onto the market, and that is branded an innovative medicine. So the word innovative has been captured. I am digressing slightly, but clearly generics play a huge role in driving down costs, except, and again, I come back to some work I've been doing with Transparency International, is that when we were interviewing people who were deciding what the country was going to buy in terms of which drugs. We were speaking to people from, traditional big pharma and generic companies, doctors on the ground, is that there seems to be in some parts of the world this idea that the branded generics are now taking the place, and actually they're actually more expensive than the originator drug, and they're copying some because they're not in the US, because we had a bit of an expression, sorry if you're American, but when we were doing this work with Transparency International, we were kind of Team America World Police, because companies have an eye on what is acceptable with the Department of Justice or the Securities and Exchanges Commission in the United States. That's where you see the big fines about bad behaviours, whether it's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And what we were seeing was there were local companies that don't have anything to do with the United States, so they're not going to be fined by the Department of Justice, they're not going to be fined by the Securities Exchanges Commission. They were flying doctors off here, there and everywhere else, the kind of behaviours that big pharmaceutical companies were criticised for in the past. Were flying doctors off, bribing doctors to use the more expensive branded generics. And so actually, rather than reduce prices, they were pushing up prices and they were more expensive than the originator drugs. So there are issues to do with generics, and we talk a lot about generics and pushing down prices, but there's ways of circumventing that. And actually, I think the latest data, and someone else might know this, is actually the generics market is the most profitable industry in the healthcare sector, that in terms of returns on actual investment. So actually the biggest profits are made there. So not that profit is a bad thing, but I think we have to be careful when we talk about generics.
Yeah, so just a few of the statistics on generics that may be helpful. In the US, 85% of all scripts are generic, but 85% of the spend is not on generics. The profitability of the generics industry you can think of in two buckets. They're the things where there are lots of competition, and there's effectively no profit for the generics industry. So cholesterol-lowering agents, pennies, and there's no profit. The place where the generics industry recently has been making money is the places where there's only one residual provider of a generic, and in fact that sometimes happens because of manufacturing problems that other generics companies have. And then when you become the last man standing, these guys have just ratcheted up price. The Mylan and the whole EpiPen phenomena has been in the news a fair bit, and most of Mylan's profitability, I think, is tied to EpiPen, even though they're making hundreds of drugs. Elizabeth, you've been looking at this from a different lens in Asia.
I think it's interesting that the generics industry presents itself as almost a philanthropic exercise. It's not. Generic companies are profit-making organizations like any other. And let's be clear about something. Generics have changed the face of availability of medicine, particularly in lower and middle income countries. So we can trash them, because we're so used to trashing big pharma, so now let's have a go at generics. But they have changed the face of particularly HIV treatment. I mean, when we were at $12,000 per patient per year and Cipla came out with $200 per patient per year, it changed what we could do in terms of tackling the AIDS epidemic. So generics have a really, really, really important function. But that should not make them untouchable. Right. And they have become, with this great halo of, changing the world, and become rather untouchable. And this is something that's a very great concern in terms of some of the stuff that I've been looking at on medicine quality. Because what you find, and we know this to be true, is that you have even some of the better known branded generic companies that are essentially running two-track production. They're running perfect quality generic production for the North American and European markets, and then for less regulated markets, they're producing the same drug at 60% or 70% active ingredient, because they know they can get away with it, because there is actually no requirement in any country for quality control on exports. So the assumption is that it's the importing country that assures its own supply chain, which if you're the United States or Europe is fine, but if you're the Central African Republic or Zambia, where you have two people doing all drug regulation for the whole country, is slightly problematic. So every time that anyone has even tried to address this, you get lockdown. You get lockdown from NGOs who say you can't start. So Oxfam were very, very, very reluctant to even engage in a discussion about the quality of generics. MSF, interestingly, I don't know if there's anyone from MSF here, but it's been really interesting that Médecins Sans Frontières have actually gone through a bit of a transformation, because they're seeing the consequences on the front line of poor quality drugs and having to pick up the pieces. They have a very good supply chain themselves, but they're seeing a lot of resistant cases coming in because people are taking poor quality and substandard drugs. So they're beginning to come around. But every time you bring up the issue of quality in generics, everyone says, oh, you're in the pay of big pharma, you know, are you here because of GSK, this. To the extent that the WHO panel that used to deal with what they then called counterfeit drugs, which is now called what I call SASFC, it's SSFFC, substandard, spurious, falsified, what's the second F, and counterfeit, or whatever.
We don't use counterfeit.
Because they can't even agree on a definition for these things. The whole of the WHO approach to medicine quality fell apart because of the war between generic companies and pharma, and the idea that there was representation of big pharma that was demanding quality of generics was covert protectionism. You're trying to drive up prices. The victims are going to be the poor, suffering people who are taking these drugs in sub-Saharan Africa and this and that. So this access to drugs agenda, which has been very, very important and in a very, very good way, has actually driven out the word that should be in brackets in every single one of those conversations, which is access to drugs that work. Access to drugs of quality. And at the moment, we're protecting access to some pretty shit drugs, truthfully. And I think that has to be something that we're able to discuss when we discuss generics and the structure of the industry.
So, Paul, you've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about manufacturing related issues for high-quality drugs from an ethical pharmaceutical company's perspective. Have you had any interactions with the generics industry, either through authorized generics or other routes that could reflect on some of the issues that Elizabeth is raising?
Yeah, a lot. We, especially in HIV today, the way it works is that when we have a drug for HIV, we immediately start working with the generics from the beginning to transfer technology and to make sure that they deliver quality. And we have been criticized a lot not to work with the patent pool, because what we do is we put a condition of quality on the outcome of the generic, which we control. Yeah? And so we didn't see anybody who was controlling the quality. And so we have the right to pull a license from the generic if they don't give quality.
Hallelujah.
Yeah? Hallelujah, yeah. But I had two things, and you said just quality. Also the use of drugs. So me and my wife, we made drugs for multi-drug resistant HIV. And nobody monitors what drugs is used for what. Yeah? And so we're all talking about the AMR resistance challenge, where antibiotics are used. In HIV, we are up to the most, I would almost say, criminal thing which is going to happen is a multi-drug resistant HIV, because there's no governance about who is using what at what time. And so I was putting also the condition that it can't be used for first line. So if you don't implement that with the government, we are not going to give you a license. So, and now what we do, and so we are now working with MDR-TB, We discovered bedaquiline, a new drug for TB. We went to CDC and WHO and say, put the guidelines out. Only use in third line with other drugs, otherwise you generate resistance. But let me quickly track a little bit back on. And so with that, you get to quality medicines. But the big challenge in getting quality medicines from generics to patients is the breakdown of the healthcare system in the countries. And the governments, normally all these governments should have quality systems. Every drug which is approved should go to a quality system in the country to make sure that they only release the drugs which are quality. And that is where the whole system, when it breaks down somewhere, somebody will misuse it. Yeah? And that's something which I think is a global problem when so now WHO for HIV has like a pre-qualification of drugs. Yeah, they are then approved. These are the drugs which can be used, and then you can do it. But that should happen almost in every area to have high quality. For us, the generics, let's say it's a challenge and a blessing on generics, because we typically get 10 years of exclusivity on a drug, and we can have like a multi-billion-dollar business if the patent, if it goes off patent, within 1 month we lose it completely. That is how this works. Yeah. So you can have like $1 billion drug. The patent expires on December 7th, January 7th. We don't sell anything anymore. That's it. Yeah. So for us, the time we have exclusivity, at that moment, we have to during that period, we have to have a return on investment to make it work. And so we stepped away from Me Too drugs on can we make something which is a little bit better than what exists, because it doesn't work anymore. You have to make medicines which survive time, survive economy and politics, yeah? Because if you focus 10, 15 years on the discovery of a new drug, and after 15 years something new, who today can tell in 15 years from now how the world would look like? Well, if HIV is not solved, we'll still need a vaccine. Alzheimer will not be solved, we'll still need drugs. Cancer will not be solved, we'll still need that type of drug. So the focus of what we try to do now is focus on real medical issues. Years of life saved, years of quality of life generated. And we just accept that we lose the products. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't battle on our patents, yeah? Because you should see what lawsuits I have to go through with the generics trying to take out the patents. And how they make money is being first. Right. So they try to fight us with bunches of lawyers in order to take your patent out fast. So we take all normal legal actions we can take based on the law to keep our patent as long as we can. That's our right. They have different rights. Yeah, they can beat us, and if the judge says, "Oh, it's gone, your patent," the drug is gone.
And what Paul's referring to is what's called the 180-day exclusivity period in the U.S., where if you're the so-called first to file, and increasingly there's not just one first to file anymore, but there's several, and the legal staffs in generics companies are large relative to the research staffs in generics companies. That 180-day period is incredibly profitable because you're selling a drug that cost you virtually nothing to make at 30 or 40 cents on the dollar or 50 cents on the dollar relative to the innovator. And for that 180 days, it's just pure profit for you. But then that collapses and people are, that's part of the Hatch-Waxman bargain, I guess. So we've heard a bit about generics. Let's talk a little bit about innovative therapies. And there's a question embedded here about working on specialized medications, and is that a good idea? And I would, before turning to Ramona, I would just offer you the following example. When I was in training, there was a syndrome endocrinologists used to see called Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. People secrete a hormone that gives rise to the worst ulcers you could ever possibly imagine. And there was this medication, omeprazole, which was only allowed to be used exclusively for Zollinger-Ellison syndrome because there was some concern with some animal data that it would give rise to a certain type of malignancy. It happened to turn out to be in rodents. That drug is now called Prilosec. It's been off patent for a while. It's eliminated an entire class of surgeries that used to be done for ulcer disease. So sometimes you think you're working on something that's very focused, and it turns out to have more general properties. Other times, that's not the case. Now, Ramona, you worked in an institution that was focused on stem cell therapy, so amongst the bright and shiny objects that people are thinking about right now. So what are the lessons that you learned from that, and how are you thinking about innovation?
Right. Well, I'm glad that we started with the large chunk of medicine that is really about using the things we already have in an appropriate way and developing health structures, because I believe in that. But I practice sort of outpatient ICU, people with extreme illnesses, cancers, complex heart and lung diseases, and there is still a need. You could argue an outsized need and profit motive behind truly innovative therapies. So this California Stem Cell Institute is a very unusual entity. It was formed when voters in California voted to fund it, and it was, I would say at the time, a political statement against the fact that the national government had put some restraints on stem cell research, and it was given $3 billion and a mandate to try to encourage cutting bleeding edge science. I'm not sure that I would have constrained scientists in the way that they did when they wrote the legislation. But that being said, I think the fundamental problem is that there's this tension. We need innovation, truly innovative drugs for complex illnesses, traumatic brain injury, spinal cord injury, cancers, things where we really, really need to make some progress that become very expensive conditions. And yet, how do we pay for them? And in the instance of stem cells, I think the feeling is it's too early for industry to get involved, too risky, too much that's not known. And what we've tried to create at the Stem Cell Institute was a funding mechanism by which that gnarly translation bit where you take an idea in great science and make it into an actual therapy that you can scale up and afford to make and provide for patients. So the state stepped in and said, we're trying to create, we want to lower the hurdles to getting these potential therapies into patients one day, because we realize it's very expensive. So, but I think that's a very unusual circumstance. So should the state of California have spent that money? I don't know. The voters decided to do it. A very good friend of mine is head of the California Department of Public Health. Her dilemma is that we have these great treatments for hepatitis C. If she treated every hep C positive patient in the California prison system, they'd be broke for the year based on the price. And yet we just defeated a proposition that would have given them
Prop 61,
61
right?
that would have allowed the government to negotiate prices. So there are these tensions. That being said, how do we pay for innovation? And right now, I guess I've made my peace with the fact that academics certainly can't do it. Governments might have a role to play, but it is the profit motive, in fact, which attracts companies into this space to spend enormous amounts of money on the development of drugs. Part of the problem, though, is that it is a broken model. It's too expensive. We need to think of ways to lower the cost of drug development. And I think one of the things that stem cells and cell-based therapies might allow us to do is to model disease in a dish and do things and bring down the cost of doing the innovation. So I'm sort of a clinician who's made my peace with the fact that I can transplant patients with new organs to the tune of $250,000 to $500,000 a year to support them, or we can work towards curing or better treatments to avoid these illnesses. Arguably, sometimes it's a lifestyle change or clean water, but sometimes it's just bad luck.
Right.
It's genetics, it's cancer, it's heart disease. And what do we owe, or patients with incredibly rare debilitating diseases, what do we owe them? We have an outsized development in some rare and difficult diseases, but they require outsized science and development to do it. So, you know, I see the promise of innovation, but the problem of paying for it is I don't know, you know, there's a tension there, and I don't know how to solve it. So
Can I just ask all of
Please.
you actually, to what extent do you think it's a zero-sum game? Because that's, something, if we're in the global health space,
Right.
there's all this, and we've seen it recently with antimicrobial resistance, actually, trying to say, okay, this model is not, or the current model of drug development is not working
It
for
certainly
new
doesn't
classes
work
of
from
antibiotics, for example.
antimicrobials to me are a public good and don't really fit very well in the business. I mean, they can fit, but it's a harder fit because it's like, especially for multi-drug resistant organisms, because they're not, it's the problem really isn't in the developed world, it's in the developing world, so you have to try to get a high price in the developed world
But
to
also
supplement.
in this case, you're trying to develop drugs to then not use them. So as
Building
Cohen was just saying,
building the firehouse in case there's a fire.
Exactly.
Right, you spend a lot of money and then you wait.
Aren't we increasingly, we talk about the patent system and, the need to sell hard before the patent
Right.
goes. Yeah, there seems to be increasing arguments that the whole R&D system is broken, how we bring drugs to market, how we prioritise. And I realise you said you don't go for Me Too's, but there are plenty. A number of stories I've done recently that just suggest that the model is broken, how we market the drugs, how we compete against a competitor. I did a story on, it's a competitor of a Janssen product called dabigatran, which is one of the direct oral anticoagulants, and the company, and I can say this, it's not defamatory because it's all been through legal, had withheld information from the FDA, from the US drug regulator, from the European Medicines Agency, that you could use the drug more effectively by simple tests to check the blood levels of that drug. So you would potentially increase the efficacy and certainly improve the safety of it. But because it wasn't offering a market advantage over warfarin, which is what it sought to replace in the treatment of atrial fibrillation, non-valvular atrial fibrillation, the company withheld that information. Now, there's so much like that seems to suggest, literally, as an investigative journalist, healthcare is the gift that keeps on giving. It is. I'm not going to be out of work anytime soon unless I have a massive lawsuit against me, which I am. And hopefully I've got
I
lawyers.
thought it was Twitter, but that's me. Yeah.
It is the gift. And there's so much of this that just seems to kind of be at the heart of how medicine is done, how drugs are developed. So, for example, I know, again, Janssen have got a drug to treat multi-drug-resistant TB. But again, how many years is it since we've had that? 50 years? Since there's... And the studies that are really needed, more from...
50 years since the first new drug.
First new drug, that's right.
And so some of the studies that are actually needed, it strikes me, as combinations of drugs to treat TB. They're the studies that aren't being done and aren't being funded, rather than, obviously we need new drugs. But again, with antimicrobial resistance, there's whole networks that have developed, like the Drugs for Neglected Diseases initiative, that are going into, that are developing drugs for things like leishmaniasis, Chagas disease, stuff that companies are not funding. And it strikes me that the whole thing needs a bit of a rethink from start to finish. And I realise that the private sector plays a role, I think governments play a role. Where governments have fallen down, and this is something that comes up time and time again, is as taxpayers, whether you're in the United States through the NIH or here through the NIHR or through charities, for example. Story I did recently was about cystic fibrosis drug, that the early compounds had been developed at universities through NIH grants and through charitable contributions to a cystic fibrosis charity, came onto the market, and the paediatricians that had been helping raise funds couldn't afford that drug for their populations. Now, as taxpayers, what are we getting back for our investments? We invest a lot of money in, probably not as much as many of us would like, but bedaquiline there was a lot of public investment in the early stages of bedaquiline, so I believe, so I've read. But what are we demanding back? Like with the AMR at the UN, what are we as taxpayers demanding back from our investments in drug discovery, when so much of them are out of reach for poorer populations? Low-income countries are often supported by things like Gavi, which is the Global Alliance of Vaccines. But then middle-income countries, there are swathes of people that can't afford or don't have access to these drugs. So we have to ask what we're getting back. And I think just take a stand back and look at the system as a whole and see whether we're actually delivering things that we actually need.
Yeah, so you know, a couple of points. I think it's useful to look at some of the history of antimicrobial work. There was a period in the 90s when, at least in the US, the FDA demanded superiority to get new antibiotics approved, right? And if you think about that and you're thinking about the evolution of drug resistance, the time that you want to develop a new drug and show that it's better is before that resistance emerges. But obviously, if you're doing a trial against a drug that's still working, it's very hard to show superiority. So the pharmaceutical industry quite rationally looked at the regulatory environment and said, you know, the game's, you know, over, so we're out. And then it required governments, including like the GAIN Act of, what was it, 6, 7, 8 years ago, to sort of come in, and the UK did similar things and say, look, we've got to change the rules here, and so we're going to do things that incent antimicrobial development. You guys have to rebuild your programs. By the way, we're going to give you these vouchers that are going to help you speed other things, so we're going to give you a benefit to do this because we recognize a public good. So I would argue that the antimicrobial dilemma that we find ourselves in was an error in regulatory judgment and a problem that was compounded over a number of years, and that unfortunately the restart is a very long-lived one, and we have to live with the consequences of the political decisions and regulatory decisions that people made because we couldn't change them at the time.
But is non-inferiority a good enough kind of trial for antimicrobial? I mean, this is kind of taking it a different way.
I think the point I would make is it's non-inferiority when resistance doesn't exist, but when resistance emerges, it's superiority.
It's superiority.
But can I answer to this?
Paul,
Yeah,
please.
because I developed with my team 2 drugs like that. And so at a certain point, you have in the evolution of drug development in a certain area, you have the maximal achievable benefit with a certain target you can get to. Yeah? And that means that if you use this type of drug, that's what you can achieve, and go over that, it doesn't pay off anyway. Right. Now, if you have the best drug as an antibiotic, then you do a non-inferiority. You can lose 2 times, on efficacy and on safety. Right. Yeah? You have no superiority, so the payers will not pay anything for a new drug. Yeah. So you don't get it, first of all, to the market, and second, nobody pays for it. Right. And the antibiotics are a challenging situation because people with pneumonia come into an intensive care. You don't know for 2-3 days whether yes or no.
So you treat them with
you treat them. You treat them, and it's only after a few days you start learning, like, this patient fails and that patient succeeded, and to get superiority on resistance at this moment in a clinical trial for pneumonia, it's impossible to do.
It's an impossible trial to do. I've
So
tried to design it.
people put you in a position that you have to say, well, we have to leave the area. Yeah?
Right. So there are these interesting structural abnormalities. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, you were...
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Because we've got a limited amount of time, we started talking a little bit about cell therapy, and there have been some incredible results lately in refractory, relapsed leukemias and certain lymphomas with cell therapy. Paul, what's J&J doing on the cell therapy side? These are necessarily expensive therapies today. You know, these are autologous T-cell therapies, $250,000 a throw. What's your sense?
We are pretty early in that. We do external investments. We have a lot of the way we approach today. A lot of things is by funding biotech companies, academic collaborations. We are working in 2 areas. Is dry AMD with cell therapy in the back of the eye, and see whether we can use that. And we have a big collaboration on diabetes, on can we do cell therapy, and that's with the California Stem Cell Institute.
Right.
And
one of the goals, I would say, is that these are potentially curative. So the idea is that you don't have to keep paying for the expensive drug. You can actually potentially cure or at least treat less often.
And by the way, I think this is a hugely important point, one that's often missed on the HCV side, that something may be expensive, but if it's truly
It's
curative,
gone. You don't take the drug the rest
it's
of your
it's
life.
a different bucket. But
It
I'm
is.
sorry, Paul, go ahead.
No, the path to therapies there is not that clear yet either.
It's
a
I agree.
long way, and we will be very open, and we are very open to once something is proven like diabetes or to put it forward. But it's very difficult at the moment to do that. The same with gene therapy. There is a very big evolution at the moment with CRISPR-Cas9
Absolutely.
on how you could do selective
Gene editing
gene
and then put a
editing.
stem cell.
It will take its time, 5, 10, 15, 20 years to go to sickle cell anemia. By definition, you should be able to solve it now.
Yeah.
It's already the severe combined immune deficiency. They've cured 8 or 9 kids with inserting the corrective gene and being able to treat them. So.
I was going to
make a
say, so
general
Deborah,
point?
this all sounds
But you know,
exciting,
it
but how
sounds
do you
really
think this
exciting,
rolls
but
out
there's so
in
many people in the world that
NHS?
just don't have the basic. Yeah, exactly. I
They
mean,
have
it's
basic healthcare
affordability.
needs.
Right.
But
We've
I wanted
got-
to get back to your earlier point about what are people getting. Well, this is a societal question, right? I mean, to a certain extent, what do you
but
want?
this is great for the people with money, the people at the top of the. There are so many people in the
Absolutely.
world who don't even have the most basic.
Right.
And that's it.
So
And it's-
should we
Your
decide
question
not
about
to do this?
taxpayers.
Yeah.
So your question about UK taxpayers, right? So
You're already
we're
paying for the
funding
basic
MRC through, whatever, the Wellcome Trust has their bit in it. We're doing all of this great research. What are UK taxpayers
getting
getting
for
for it? And the fact is, truthfully, as we've seen with recent events, UK taxpayers care about UK taxpayers. UK taxpayers don't give a shit what someone in the Gambia is getting out of
But
it.
it's not
or
just.
what
But it's
someone-
not just funding. But what I'm saying is that's not just funding. So the AMR question isn't just affecting people in the Gambia, etc., etc.
No.
It's what is going to affect people going into theatre here and now in the UK. If we are talking about
Okay.
UK taxpayers, so the UK government was partly behind the AMR issue. What were they saying to the companies when they were putting money in to help develop new antibiotics? Were they saying, we want guarantees that the NHS is going to be able to afford this in years to come, that our health system is under a massive squeeze? Are they putting in those guarantees and those kind of stipulations? I'm not convinced they are.
No, they're definitely not. I'm 100% with you on this. I'm 100% with you. I'm just saying that we have to be realistic about what you can get a public movement
Right.
to do. So we can see, we saw in the case of HIV, the reason that we have HIV drugs now is because patient activism, forced the issue back in the 80s, and that was why we have the miracle of antiretrovirals. But getting people, getting the mass of society excited and activated to demand of their government, to then demand of.
But it's not just the government, the people that were saying, the space, the industry are kind of looking at stem cell and developing stem cells and willing to take the time and the effort, and there might be a breakthrough, there mightn't be a breakthrough, but that same will doesn't seem to be afforded by the people that are, the bottom of the pile in parts of the world.
So
that
let
can't
me
afford it.
let me highlight an element of this discussion that I think is a fundamental conflict we face, which is we can focus on the individual in medicine, or we can focus on the society in medicine. We can define the society by national borders or globally. And there's an intrinsic tension. Therapies like, CAR T-cell therapy for ALL is by definition all about the individual. Some of the things that we're talking about here are real,
Society.
multiple drug-resistant bacteria, that's really much more of a societal question. And so there's a natural tension between the two. And, and I think that's the whole question of what does the British government or the British taxpayer want to pay for. Same thing's being asked of the US. In the US, people sit there and say, wait a second, we're subsidizing drug development for
the rest
the
of the world.
entire world because of the prices we pay. So at some level, how do you confront this tension between the individual and the societal issue? I mean, Paul, you must think about
Well,
this.
I being 30 years now in this field, I got very pragmatic about it, is that if you take the last 100 years of drug discovery, development, and healthcare, then if you look from since our grandfathers, how much diseases have we got out of the world? Yeah? And why is life expectancy where it is in a combination of sanitation and drugs? And so antibiotics made a huge difference. TB, there is no TB almost anymore in the UK, or in not like in there's a little. There's a little, but at the same time, no, if you go to Davos of Montreux, you had the institutions, not like it used to be. Yeah. So then you go to high blood pressure with some good pills, you can keep it under control. Diabetes, insulin. If you go and then if you talk about disease of the developing world, we discovered mebendazole, which is a drug today used by 1 billion people every year. It's like totally out there. So
antiparasitic.
Antiparasitic, sorry. Then vaccines, if you look at what was implemented over time from the childhood vaccination, polio, measles, you name it. So there is, between the innovative West and the generic global, there is a 10-year lag. And so if we don't do innovations going forward and every time, I worked through a few antimycotics. We start with miconazole, ketoconazole, itraconazole, and then Pfizer brought fluconazole. In the end, you get to antimycotics which solve 95% of the issues. And then these get generic 10 years afterwards. Now they are available on a global scale. Right. So I see, like, if we can fight for the best science, the best new technologies, have some exclusivity on patents for us to pay for it. 10 years later, I can say to the world, they're yours. And then with a 10-year lag, hepatitis C drugs will be there for everyone. HIV drugs will be there. And in that meantime, we have the political battle to say, let's make them available. Yeah, we'll do that. And we'll fight hard about it, but 10 years later they offer the world.
Can I bring back, can I just repose your question?
Yeah, sure.
Which I think is a really interesting one. So as we're moving into an era of more and more personalised medical technologies, does that model still hold? Because, you know, if you make a drug that works for everyone who's suffering from that thing, then that model holds.
I'm a believer that
go global, but
you have to go through that in order to get to general drug. I did 25 years of HIV research. I did 600,000 patient diagnostics in the world to learn about the resistance and to guide patients. And with that, we were able to improve drug after drug after drug after drug, from small spectrum to broader spectrum to extreme broad spectrum to combination which now block every virus. If you go after cancer, if you do diagnostic, learn about who will respond, who not. Year after year after year, you will be able to improve. And one day, you know what? 3 drugs combined, an immunodrug, this and that. 10 years later, it will be available to everybody. So if you don't go through that, we won't have it. And that's where I think we live in a world. And let me make one comment on generics. Who are our shareholders? That is your fathers, your mothers, yourself in the room. Pension funds, the Wellcome Trust, the Rhodes Fund here, the fact that we are sitting here, they are our shareholders. We are pushed by our shareholders to make a capital return.
I've got a really
So we pay, and I'm going to be very blunt about who we are and what we do. After all what we do,
I'm a shareholder of yours.
After all what we do, we pay a 3% dividend.
I know.
We take a very high tax. JSK in the UK is pushed to pay 5% dividend by the pension funds. So it is like the pension funds are pushing us to be a profitable business. Now, then you have evolution and selection pressure. Those companies who can survive in that area of making 3 to 5% return on investment can continue to attract capital and can continue to do research and development for new products. Those who don't do that disappear. Look who disappeared. Astra is AstraZeneca, J is JS and K. SmithKline, welcome N. Welcome.
You remember Marion Merrill Dow.
Dow. So there are, for one biotech company today who succeed, there are 30 who fail. So in order to get a return for the venture capital, you need to have an outcome. And you can vote for having this whole system break down, but the evolution has not been able to come up with something different.
An alternative.
Very open to have something different, but I don't know how we can do it.
It's really interesting you say that. This was kind of just after the general election, so it was 2015 here, and I went to the annual general meeting. There's an organisation in the UK called Shareholders United, and they buy a share in all companies so they can have a journalist or a representative go to an annual general meeting. So I went to GSK's last year and I went with Médecins Sans Frontières and they've been having a campaign about the pneumococcal vaccine and they've made by GSK and Pfizer and they've been campaigning on the issue that lack of access, so they've done some work. And this is one issue, and I'm not sure whether you mind discussing it, but it's companies don't really want to talk about pricing of drugs. And again, that was something, or transparency over pricing. And again, the work with Transparency International, that came up repeatedly. But some preliminary work done by Médecins Sans Frontières had found that Morocco were paying 5 times the price for pneumococcal vaccine than was France. You know, and you look at the kind of relative, you know, GDP in those two countries. And Andrew Whitty was still CEO at the time, and the MSF asked, put their hand up, and they'd warned Andrew Whitty they were coming. Now I'm sitting there with my tape recorder. Sorry, I'm not wired now. And well, I am actually. I am.
You are, right?
Slightly different, but I'm not undercover. And MSF stuck their hand up and said, you know, Mr. Whitty, we have calculated about a million children die each year unnecessarily of pneumococcal disease because of lack of access. And that might be governments, kind of structuring governments, but this is pricing. And they had it backwards and forwards. MSF had sat down, this is a doctor that works out in the field in infectious diseases, sat down, and literally as she sat down, someone from Hertfordshire, anyone that lives in the UK will know Hertfordshire, nice kind of wealthy home counties, just outside London. A guy from Hertfordshire stood up just immediately after the woman from MSF had sat down saying 1 million children die a year because of pricing. Said, Mr. Whitty, where's the return on my dividends? I want more money. Literally, it kind of happened like that. So that, to me, showed some of the pressures on drug companies. On the one hand, they wanted, to be fair to GSK, wanted to do the right thing. And on the other hand, they had the shareholders making those demands. And that was about as stark as an example, I think.
I think it's well said. So, I would say Paul made an eloquent case for the generic dividend being a 10-year delay, and I think you're hearing about the tensions that are in the industry. We probably have time for some questions from the audience. So, Agnes.
Sorry?
I hope you're enjoying this spirited discussion.
Yes, we enjoy.
Please.
I like your discussion on generic. And that's true that millions of people are alive just because of generic. But most of the generic industry are bought by those who are selling branded. Another thing is, we should not, sorry for my English, you have to cope with it.
Okay.
We should not forget also medical device. I want to bring here medical devices like bed nets. Have you heard about the big scandal 2 years ago about the fake bed nets? In my country, 16% of my health budget went to buy fake bed nets. WHO approved.
Right.
Nobody moved.
Yeah.
I tried to sue the factory. There is no law.
Yeah.
I tried to get the support of Global Fund, because what is Global Fund? It's a public-private partnership, isn't it?
Yes.
There is a lot of your tax in that.
Right.
Can we save the taxpayer money by spending better? Global Fund let me down.
Yeah.
WHO let me down. I went myself to FDA in the US and say, you know, you are there to protect the health of Americans, but also their money, isn't it?
Right.
We use your taxpayer money to buy fake bed nets. What can you do for me? Nothing.
That's very interesting.
So, international regulation are needed. It will protect your factories, it will protect the health of the people. If not, we are just there because in nice dinner like that, we are sitting with criminals that need to be brought at La Hague for crime against humanity. How many people died? $18 million we spent for fake bed nets. Proof by international lab. So we can spend better, develop more drugs if we have better regulation. If not, we have a criminal organization out there that kill more than those head of states that we, the world, identify as criminal. And we are all applauding when we catch them.
Yeah.
And we all take cocktail with the other criminals.
Yeah. Thanks, Agnes, and I'll apologize for my American, but I'll turn the floor over to Elizabeth.
No, I think that you're absolutely right. We're letting people get away with things, but also so we talk about the brokenness of the R&D system, but we also have quite a broken regulatory system because we are putting the burden of regulation, we're spreading the burden of regulation onto every country, which is not where a huge...
It's the biggest hypocrisy ever.
Yes, ma'am. So I think that we can actually look to other industries for different ways of doing things. So in the aviation industry, for example, it's basically, so the way aviation is, if I understand it correctly, is regulated. What we have is if any airline from your country is judged to not maintain decent standards of safety and etc., then no airline from your country can fly to Europe, right? So it's essentially creating peer pressure for regulation within a country, and we could do that for drugs. If we could say, if any Indian-made generic is found to be substandard, then no Indian-made generic is allowed into our system. But the reason we can't do that, and we can't do that because 85% of scripts in the US are generics, and the system would collapse.
Right.
So we're all in this conspiracy of silence about the very things, and we don't call them criminal because partly they say, oh, but we had an FDA inspection on a Tuesday. Well, Tuesday's the day that we're doing things for the US market, so we're doing things at perfect, whatever. We won't address these issues precisely because it's too scary to take down the whole pack of cards. And I think that that's something that you should go to the FDA and scream about at every opportunity.
Yeah. And you've got a story.
I've noted it.
Right, and there's another interesting point that I think you made, which is that the device industry doesn't really have a generic equivalent.
They don't.
And that is
a whole new world.
a place where a lot could be accomplished. Paul, you had some things that you
No,
wanted to
I
say?
think what happened during the Ebola epidemic with the on the regulatory front in Africa was very encouraging, where countries started to work together and brought expertise from different countries into the regional centers, where it was not one country like Sierra Leone on its own, because they didn't have the capabilities, but South Africa brought capabilities in and different countries. And I think if I'm pushing since a long time for some European Commission funding to make sure that Africa itself can do regulatory authorities in a way that you can govern yourself, yeah? But it requires pharmacists, it requires a lot of capabilities which today are not developed at in the universities. And so it will take some time, but it has to be governed by the countries themselves with the right capabilities. So you, as Minister of Health in Rwanda, should have been able to say, you know what, it's not approved by me and my staff, it's not been controlled by the central agency, it doesn't come into the country, yeah? Okay. And that's the only way, in the end, how it will work.
And if I do that, I lose the 18 million because I don't spend it on time.
Yeah.
So
That's something else, yeah.
we are trapped, and we are trapped in the incapability to have 5-star labs, okay? Because my lab proved that it was fake, but it's not an accredited lab.
Accredited lab.
So,
Of which there are only 6 in all of sub-Saharan
yes,
Africa.
Yeah.
and also this is also international corruption, madam. International corruption.
Yeah.
I'm going to come and have a chat
Yeah,
with
so-
you again. Don't worry, I've already noted.
It sounds like we'll be reading about that, but one more question, and then we have to finish up. And thank you for the passion in the audience. Yeah, one more?
No, oh, there's one.
John?
I've done a bit of drug company work for Janssen. For a few minutes, I was on the advisory panel for Lebeluzole. This is Declaration of Conflict of Interest, which was a great drug to protect your brain if you were a gerbil and you knew you were going to have a stroke in about 3 hours. But it failed at the final
that's
stage.
About a third of my colleagues.
Yeah,
Okay.
there you go.
We're good.
Yeah, but if you were a human who just had a stroke, it didn't work. So but I actually think, to some extent, we've solved, and I'm not trying to trivialise the issue, the relationships between government, the big pharma and the medical industry for a number of reasons. Some of it's regulatory. So in Australia now, if I were to accept a seminar, it now gets published on the ACCC website.
Sunshine.
That I attended a dinner hosted by my name. So that's a very interesting regulatory approach to some of these conflicts. Doesn't mean I can't go, but it does mean we think about it. But the real reason is, and I want to echo my colleague here, the real scandal, if I were an investigative journalist, is the medical device and technology company. There's a complete imbalance of power. Geez, you've just had a heart attack, you need this stent. You know, where's the informed consent and power relationship in that? It's really sexy to put stuff into people or attach devices. And that's really where the looming scandal is. You know, there are, by all account, orthopedic surgeons in Germany who have Mercedes given to them for choosing a particular device and a jig. There's a robot company, a surgical robot company that signs surgeons up and says if you sign up 100 patients a year to use our robot, you'll get a favourable rate. We know that stents don't work any better than coronary artery bypass grafting, but in the old days, the cardiologists were the gatekeepers for the surgeons, just as when I write a script, I'm not the dispenser. Unless you're in Japan, you don't dispense, you're arm's length. But when you're doing devices, you are the advisor and the dispenser. And that's where the corruption and scandal is happening. We know that drug-eluting stents don't work. We actually know they're bad. And guess which learned journal that was published in? The Wall Street Journal, under the continuous disclosure to the stock exchange, not in New England Journal. And we actually, that's how it came up. So really, and that's going to spill over into the developing world next. And we will be attacking them and their vulnerabilities with these devices. We haven't even got regulation right on this in the first world countries. And I really think that's where the stories are for the next 20 years, because of this mishmash of relationship where the doctor is no longer the advocate for the patient. The doctor's got too much interest in being the dispenser.
Yeah. So, John, fascinating point. I mean, there was a period of time when we used to say that the indication for a stent was a femoral artery. Or
the school fees.
Pardon me?
The school fees.
Yes, right. But we've run out of time. I want to thank the panel not only for the thoughtful comments, but also for the passion that they brought to this discussion. And I hope we'll have time in the time that follows this to say thank you to them individually and discuss these topics more, because they're clearly heartfelt. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.